This is the Comics Alternative, on location and talking with creators at Small Press Expo 2018, Part 1. Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek, and this is the first of two shows, including my brief interviews with a variety of creators who attended Small Press Expo 2018. But before we get to those conversations, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative on location is brought to you by those great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And head on over to dcbservice.com right now and you can find unbelievable savings on a variety of comics for the month of September. And as we like to point out on the podcast, one of the best ways of getting your comics is in bundled form. DCB Service regularly offers bundles of comics from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. For example, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find a Vertigo bundle, a Jinx World bundle, and 4 other DC bundles at incredible discounts. And this month, you can find all of the bundles at anywhere from 45 to 50% off of the cover price. All of this just goes to show that you can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. Whenever I attend comics conventions, I like to go around and talk with the artists who table at the event. One of my favorite cons is Small Press Expo, which takes place in North Bethesda, Maryland, every September. This past weekend, I was lucky enough to be at the event. I got to hang out with several creators whom I had already befriended, and I was also able to meet a number of people for the first time and learn about the comics works that they do. Many of these wanted to talk with me for the podcast, and what you're about to hear is a series of brief interviews with creators during my first day of SPX. These conversations range from 4 to about 17 minutes in length, and while most were recorded on the floor of the convention, some were conducted in more quiet rooms or outside on the hotel's patio. Some of the people I talk with may be familiar to regular listeners of the podcast, as we've discussed their work or interviewed them before, although many will be new to you and to me. This is the first of 2 on-location shows that you'll be hearing this week, and in this episode, I talk with 15 different creators, including Mike Freiheit, Madeline McGrane, Kelly Phillips and Claire Folkman, Karl Christian Krumpholz, Max de Radiguès, Ryan Holmberg, Scott Roberts, Nathan Gelgud, M. Dean, Emi Gennis, Alex Nall, Ash Thomas and Sara Guzman, and Ellen Lindner. Now let's get going. I am at Small Press Expo in Bethesda, Maryland, 2018. And as I like to do when I'm at Small Press Expo, I go around and talk with a variety of different creators about the kind of work that they do, and especially those that I'd like to introduce to our listening audience. And right now I'm standing in front of the table of Mike Freiheit. He is the author most recently of Monkey Chef, which I think just came out from Kilgore Books, right?
It came out in June.
Okay, so yeah, I remember it being part of the Kickstarter project that Dan does.
Yeah, so Dan did a Kickstarter for, I think, like about 10 different books, and Monkey Chef was one of them. It's one of the largest books they've ever published, so it's about 230 pages. It's full color. And it just kind of details the time I spent living in South Africa, and I worked at a primate sanctuary over about a year.
That's the title.
Yeah, that's the title. And it has to deal with like relationship stuff and kind of how humans interact with monkeys and other animals. So it's called Monkey Chef, A Love Story, because it's about my romantic tribulations, or trials and tribulations, and how people relate to like monkeys and the love for animals, basically.
Yeah. Where did the idea for this work come from? Just your own experiences that you wanted to write about?
Yeah, it's all autobiographical. I lived in New York, and I always wanted to go study primates, like in the semi kind of natural habitat. And I found this primate sanctuary in South Africa, and just on a whim, I was really sick of living in New York, and it was like beating me down, and as it does to people. And I was like, well, I'm going to apply to this thing. I probably won't get in, but we'll see. And I applied to it, and they were like, yeah, come on over for a few months and like do this. The position was for a cook for the humans, but also for the primates. So I was doing double duty as the cook for the humans and making and preparing all the food for the monkeys.
Okay, so tell me how the preparation for the monkeys' cuisine worked.
So there's two different kitchens, one for the humans and one for the primates or for the monkeys. And we would cook things like, but most of the monkeys were small marmosets about the size of like a squirrel, basically. They're from Brazil originally. And so we would take things like eggs, and we would microwave them until it was like an omelet, like this disgusting amorphous blob. And then we would cut it up into like tiny little chunks, just the size of like, just a tiny little chunks for the marmoset, so they could like get their hands around it. And then we'd cut all that stuff up, bunch of fruit. They would have, a protein, a carbohydrate, and also like snacks. Like for some reason, the woman who ran the place, the sanctuary, gave them jelly, like Jell-O, basically. So they would get that as like a treat. We fed them all types of stuff, but it was mostly in the same line as like what humans need. But they were kind of badly. Most of the animals were rescues from the pet trade, because these tiny monkeys, people take them in and try and take them as pets, and then they reach sexual maturity and just go nuts. So the sanctuary takes them in from the pet trade and tries to give them a good life, which I think is why she gave them like jelly and weird stuff like that, because she was trying to like pamper them because they had such a crappy life.
Okay, well, tell me how you came across Dan and Kilgore Books and Comics.
So I'm one of the organizers of Chicago Alternative Comics Expo, and I've been living in Chicago for 5 or 6 years now. I just go to conventions every year, and Dan's always been a presence there, and always been one of the most supportive people for independent creators. So I think I was been working on this book for like 4 years, 3.5 without a publisher, and I was like, no matter what, I'm going to get this thing published. So I was taking it around to everyone. People were like, oh, it's good, but we don't want it, like that kind of thing. And I gave it to Dan. He was like, yeah, man, it's really good. We really got to, get this thing going. Like, this sounds good. Let's do it. And I was like...
You sound like Dan, by the way.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to do a Dan impersonation. Like, yeah, man. I think he sounds like that. Tons of energy. He just loves comics. So, yeah, just through, like, the convention scene and being around and handing my book to him, handing, like, my manuscript or, galley copy or whatever.
Yeah, Kilgore is one of our favorite publishers on the Comics Alternative. We've discussed their titles quite a number of times on the show, even having spotlight episodes devoted to a seasonal release or seasonal releases of Kilgore.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I for me, it was like just the best match. And, there's other publishers, like bigger publishers or whatever, and if they published a book, I would have been like, fine. But just meeting Dan and seeing his enthusiasm and the books that come out of Kilgore, I was like, this is a perfect fit. And he was the first person who like read my book or my manuscript and was like, offered all these things like, I get this, I understand what you're going for, and no one else had done that up to that point. He's just a gem of a person.
He is. So tell me about some of the other things that you've worked on, or maybe what you're working on right now, a newer project, whatever you can reveal.
Yeah, totally. So Monkey Chef was originally 2 issues that I put out by myself, and none of the material is in the new book. I set it up that way so you can still read all of them. And still
So this volume 1 here that I see on your table of Monkey Chef, this material's not in the graphic novel that just came out recently.
Yeah, no, I set it up that way so I wasn't like repeating myself. There's a few elements from the first issue that are in the graphic novel, but I redid all them or retooled it a different way. And then there's also a second issue which just has its own standalone story. And right now I'm working on the third issue of this, which is called Go Fuck Myself, which is kind of autobiographical, but it's a lot of made-up stuff. It's basically different versions of me throughout time, kind of trying to deal with depression and, living life, and also a bunch of weird stuff about agriculture and how humans relate to each other. So it's still in the same vein as Monkey Chef, but just a whole lot weirder. And then I'm working on a purely fiction horror comic called Woods, and that should be out next year. I'm working on it right now, and that's just going to be probably like my biggest kind of foray into fiction.
Is that going to be self-published, or is that going to be maybe a Kilgore book?
I don't know yet. I would love, I would love for Kilgore to put it out. We'll see what happens. But that one's still in the layout stages, so I'm still like finishing the story, but I'm very excited about it.
So if our listeners wanted to find out more about your work and maybe even get copies of some of the things that you have available, where would they go? What's your website? What's your store? Or how can people get in touch?
So it's just MikeFreiheit.com. Last name is Freiheit. Or you can go to Kilgore's website, which I think is just KilgoreBooks.com.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it. Other than that, I mean, those are the best places. I think it's on, even if you just do a search for the title, you'll find it on Amazon and stuff too, but you probably want to buy it from Kilgore.
Yeah, Kilgore or Amazon. But with these smaller comics, like I say, the individual issues that you've mentioned of Monkey Chef and then the Go Fuck Myself, they can get it through your website.
Yep, exactly.
Well, Mike, thank you for taking the time and talking with me. It's been great meeting you, and good luck with SPX.
Thanks so much. Pleasure.
I'm here with Madeline McGrane, and I have to admit I am not familiar with her comics, but I was walking by her table, and I see titles that are quite intriguing. There are various vampire titles, The Worst Vampires in the World, Vampire Comics, Vampire Horse, and The Werewolf Bandit, and Attic Secrets, and that's just scratching the surface. So I wanted to stop by and have Madeline introduce her work to me and also to our listeners. Madeline, I know it just started, but how's XPX going for you so far?
It's going pretty well so far. Yeah.
So, as I said, introduce me and our listeners to your work.
All right. So I make a lot of comics about vampires. I kind of have this ongoing series of short comics about these 3 vampire children. And separate from that, I make a comic called Vampire Horse about a horse that's also a vampire. It's a Western. And then I make a queer vampire Western called Dirt Creek Runs with Blood. Okay, so that's a pretty good rundown of what I have at my table and what I'm working on right now.
And is Attic Secrets part of the vampire series as well?
Yes, it's the longest comic that I have with the vampire kids.
Now, these are self-published works. Do you have, let's say, a web presence? Do these begin as web comics and then you print them? What's the process?
Yeah, they primarily begin as web comics, and then I print them for shows usually. So.
Okay, and one of the reasons why I ask is because we have a monthly webcomic series, and usually every October we like to look at horror or horror-related webcomics. So that's something I could definitely check out. Now, if someone wanted to see your comics online to get a taste of the kind of work that you do, where would they go?
You could go to my website, which is MadelineMcGrane.com.
One word?
Yes. Or you could check out my work on Twitter or Instagram at MadMcGrane.
Okay, so tell me, what is it about vampires that fascinates you so?
I think they're neat, and they're kind of like this like tropey, well-established thing, and then so you can like start writing about them and like make work about them and like explore a lot of ideas, and you kind of already have this groundwork. And I'd also just like the aesthetic. I like bats and capes and stuff like that. So.
And again, being unfamiliar with the comic, I'm not sure, but do you deal with the subject matter in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way at times?
Very much so, yes. It's a lot of it is very humorous. I mean, like Vampire Horse, that's kind of silly, you know.
So, in addition to your work with the various vampire titles, do you have any other comics that either you may be currently working on or maybe you have ideas for in the future?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I'm kind of like cooking in my head right now. Yeah.
Because it sounds like, from what you described and looking at the art, that something like you do would be perfect for a publisher, let's say like First Second.
I mean, that's up to them.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, Madeline, I thank you for taking the time and talking with me, and I wish you the best of luck at Small Press Expo.
Thank you so much. It was good talking to you.
Kelly Phillips and Claire Folkman, I'm here at their table, and they have a comics anthology, and I've never seen before, so I want them to introduce it to me. It's called Dirty Diamonds. So, how are you guys doing?
Oh, we're doing great.
Great, yeah. It's the beginning of the show. It's hectic. It's fun. It's great.
Well, I'm glad you take a few minutes out of the hectic schedule to talk with me in the podcast. So, okay, what is Dirty Diamonds?
So Dirty Diamonds is an all-girl comic anthology, and what we do for each issue is we do an open call, and we ask for female or femme comic creators to submit proposals to us of autobiographical comics around that theme. And then for each issue, we do a different theme, and we do about one a year, and we kickstart it to be able to not only publish the book, but all of our creators get paid through that Kickstarter as well.
So each of your volumes of the anthology begins on Kickstarter?
That is correct.
It's interesting. I'm not familiar with this, but it reminds me of The Strumpet, which is also an all-woman anthology that is theme-based as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we think it's a really good opportunity for the creators to respond to a similar theme in a huge variety of ways. So I think one of the big joys that we get every year is just sort of seeing all of the unexpected and interesting and clever ways that people relate to what we try to choose as pretty universal, generally approachable themes.
So you've been around for a while, and I see you're up to, volume 9 or issue 9?
Yep. Premiering today.
Yeah.
Wow, so it's debuting at SPX.
I just opened our first box this morning.
Wow, I feel like I'm in the middle of something magical now. Okay, so tell us some of the themes that you've had in the various volumes.
Yeah, so the current volume that we're debuting today is Being, which is probably our most abstract, loosey-goosey sort of theme. But in the past, we've done sex, imagination, beauty. We did a volume about comics, and then we also have an omnibus of our first 4 issues, which were all done photocopier style on the floor. So that one covers alcohol, jobs, travel, and breakups.
Okay. This one that's just debuting this weekend, Being, it reminds me that Jean-Paul Sartre, being in nothingness. Is there anything philosophical in that?
There is so much philosophical in there. There's actually a really great part of this is we, as editors, because we do proposals, we work with each of the artists individually to really make sure we're pushing their stories in the most diverse perspectives possible. So we've got really funny and sweet and heartfelt comics, and we've got really sad and depressing and deep comics, but we want to make sure we're showing the full breadth of any topic that we cover because the world is so incredible and different and unique, and we really want to be able to share that same caliber of story with all of our readers.
So differences in art style, differences in storytelling style, as well as approaches and focuses, as long as it's a particular theme that you have for a volume.
And we always ask for the girls to run with the theme. We want things that we wouldn't have even thought to ask for. We love rule breakers. We love people who want to come in and be I kind of want to talk about this and it's sort of related in this way. And that's where we as editors really get to step in and be yes, push this aspect, pull this aspect back. I really want to see a lot of this. I want to see a little less of that. And we can really help these people grow artistically as well. And we also get amazing comics out of it.
So, Claire, both you and Kelly are the editors of, so the publishers, editors, just the 2 editors of Dirty Diamonds.
Yep.
What are some of the challenges? You've talked about some of the joys, and I've worked as an editor and currently do. Do you think are some of the challenges of working as editors of an anthology?
Well, for us in particular, we've had a streak of about 60 people per book. So that's a lot of people and a lot of work to be keeping track of on what always ends up being pretty ambitious timelines. But just making sure that you give everyone that individualized attention, making sure that you're keeping track of their work and what they're trying to get out of it, I think is both fun and challenging. But it's good to have a fun challenge like that. But then there's also just the, editing a 200-plus page book. It's what is the error that I'm going to print this time? So it's nice when you find a little one and you're good, covered, not one that has been on the spine of a book before.
But we don't talk about that.
Yeah, I think the most arduous process is the Kickstarter itself, because that's just 30 days of sweating and not sleeping until you hit your funding goal. But I think people also don't realize how many months of planning go into a Kickstarter campaign, and then the months that go into the fulfillment and distribution of the book, too. But it's such a great way to proliferate your work and to get people familiar with you and the creators. So it's a good payoff.
Well, in all your Kickstarters, have you met all of the goals each time?
Yes, we've been fully funded each time, thank God.
Now, I know that issue number 9, Dirty Diamonds, Being, as the theme, has just come out, as you mentioned. What about volume 10? What might we expect for that? Have you made solid plans?
So we have a policy of never announcing a theme before the time to announce the open call is, so you'll just have to follow us on the internet and find out.
Well, that leads me to my next question, because I was going to ask if our listeners wanted to find out more about Dirty Diamonds and maybe get back issues and maybe get alerted when your next Kickstarter goes up, how can they find you guys?
Yeah, we have a website. It's dirtydiamonds.net, and that'll take you to all our social media. We're either Dirty Diamonds Yo on Instagram and Twitter or Dirty Diamonds Comic on Facebook and Tumblr. That'll let you know any open calls that we announce, any new book releases, any Kickstarter announcements. And there's also a newsletter you can sign up for, and then you'll get blasted with all the news right in your inbox.
Okay, so dirtydiamonds.net, and then that'll give them links to everything and all ways of getting in touch with you. The newsletter they can sign up for and know when your next Kickstarter, and open call. So not only people who read comics, but people who create comics should get in touch with you.
Yeah, and if you want to pick up any of the copies of the book or take a look at some of the comics that are in them, you can go on our web store, which is also linked on our website.
Okay. Kelly, Claire, I thank both of you for taking the time and talking with me for the podcast. I hope you have a great Small Press Expo.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm at the table of Karl Christian Krumpholz, and he is a creator who works on a series, 30 Miles of Crazy. And I was just introduced to him by a good friend at Kilgore Books, Dan Stafford. Dan's great at introducing me to different people, and he introduced me a little while ago to Karl. So now I'm here at his table, and I want him to tell me and the listeners about the kind of things that he does. How you doing, Karl?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, okay, you have how many issues of 30 Miles of Crazy?
I've got 6 issues, 6 floppy issues, and then I have 2 little graphic novels that collects a lot of the earlier comics that I did from a couple years ago.
Okay, so what is 30 Miles of Crazy?
30 Miles of Crazy is a slice of life comic. It's true stories of the city. People tell me their stories about living in the city. It doesn't matter which one. I've got stories from New York, from Boston, from Philadelphia, from Denver. And if it's a good story, it's a sad story, a funny story, I illustrate it.
Okay. So you said that they're kind of a slice of life, true life stories. Do you go for a particular angle? I mean, is it just anything in life, or is it a certain aspect or facet of existence?
It's everything in life. For me, it just has to be a good story. I got stories about people who live on the street and what they go through daily. I've got stories about a bartender telling me about some jerk he's got to kick out. I got a story of a woman telling me about her fascination with licking masterpieces at museums.
Licking masterpieces?
Yes, she would. When she was a child, she loved to lick the paintings on the wall.
Okay, I think this is the first time in the history of the comics alternative that licking masterpieces has come up as a phrase. I also see that you have here the city the city was never going to let go. Now, is this part of the series as well, or is it something else?
The city was never going to let go is an offshoot of 30 Miles of Crazy, just very slightly. I did an experiment where I started trying to tell stories in one panel, little one-panel comics, and this was basically a collection of those one-panel comics about living in the city.
Okay, so how long has 30 Miles of Crazy been going on?
For about 3-4 years.
Okay. What was the instigating force behind this idea?
Well, what happened was I wanted a new comic idea, and it started off more along the lines of bar stories. You know, you're sitting around the bar, someone's like, oh yeah, this just happened to me the other day, and I was like, oh, and I started illustrating them. And from the bar stories, I started telling greater stories of the city.
Okay. And you're particularly drawn, I guess, to those kind of slice of life, or what we've called on the comics alternative, déjeuner vérité stories.
Oh, okay, I've never heard that term before.
Well, and we actually, my co-host Gene came up with that because we were uncomfortable with the other ways of talking about true-to-life stories.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't necessarily like slice of life. We didn't like, let's say, reality or naturalism. And so Gene came up with déjeuner vérité.
Déjeuner vérité.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to use that.
Yeah. Have you ever written within any particular genre, or is it just true-life stories?
It's just true life stories. Yeah. As I said, some of them are happy, some of them are funny, some of them are sad.
Okay.
You know, I've been getting a lot of stories about gentrification of neighborhoods.
Oh, wow.
From both angles. Some people hate it, some people love it, and I've been hearing stories, and I try to play fair and tell their stories.
And you self-publish?
Yes.
So if people wanted to find out more about 30 Miles of Crazy and some of your other work, and also get copies of your comics, where would they go online to find you?
That you can go to 30milesofcrazy.com, 30 with the number, or KarlChristianKrumpholz.com, Karl Christian, Christian, Krumpholz, KRUMPHOLZ.com. Also, Kilgore is carrying my books, Birdcage Bottom is carrying my books, Tinto Press is carrying my books. You can just get them from their websites. Or if you prefer digital, Comixology has mine.
Oh, really? So they can find them on Comixology as well?
Yes. And also my website has a store, and I sell them there as well.
Okay. So you're currently working on, I guess, the next installment of 30 Days of Crazy?
30 Miles of Crazy. I am working
30 Miles, I'm sorry.
I'm working on a bunch of things right now. I'm always doing more 30 Miles of Crazy. I'm working on a sequel to my bio comic, Introduction to Alcohol, which is about me growing up in bars and my relationship with my father. I'm also working on, I do a weekly comic for the Westward newspaper in Denver.
Okay. And they can find all of this work or references to it from your website?
Correct.
Well, Karl, thank you very much for talking with me for the show and for introducing me to 30 Miles of Crazy and some of your other work as well. It's been great meeting you, and I recommend that our listeners definitely check you out.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great talking to you.
Listeners of the podcast probably remember a few months ago I had Max de Radiguès on the show to talk about his new book at the time from Conundrum, Ouija, about the famous crime photographer. We had a really nice conversation, and one of the things that Max had mentioned during that interview is that he had a new book that would be coming out in the fall from Fantagraphics, Bastard. That book, I believe, is out now, or it's debuting perhaps this week at Small Press Expo, and I have the pleasure of now sitting in front of Max. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, and it's nice to meet you in person after having interviewed you on the show from quite a distance.
Exactly, and now I don't have my kid with me, so it's going to be less noisy. So it's going to be...
Yeah, we had kind of an experience at first when you're with your son and your wife were coming home and you were in the middle of the interview.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so is Bastard, the new book, is it debuting this weekend, or has it already come out? I don't know when the official press date is.
I have no idea. I know it's debuting now for the show, but I don't know if it's out in the stores yet, but it should be any day now, I guess.
When was the original pub date in Belgium?
It was published a bit more than a year ago, June 2017. Yeah.
Okay, so for those who may not be familiar with the new book, Bastard, if you can just give us a summary or a pitch, what is it about?
So we follow a mom and her kid, and we quickly understand that they're running away from a robbery. They made an armed robbery, and so they're running away from the police, but there's also... they're part of a big group, kind of gang members, and so the gang is following them too. So it's like a kind of I don't know how to say that in English, but it's runaway story. It's you say runaway for that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I think that's a good way of describing it.
And so it's kind of a road trip, and so there's a lot of gun action and violence, but it's mostly about the relation between the mom and her son, and what's happening between them, and how and why would you raise your kid in that field.
And the son, who I guess is the titular character, he's called by other people a bastard. That's Eugene, right?
Exactly, Eugene.
Yes. And, one of the things I appreciated about Bastard is the fact that you don't deal with heavy exposition. In other words, what you were describing about a mother and her son on the runaway, they're connected to a larger group of criminals and thieves. You don't throw that out at the very beginning. I mean, we learn little bits along the way, and I appreciate that because it makes the reading experience that much more enjoyable, that if you go a few more pages, you'll learn a little more about, let's say, the mother, who at different times is called April or May or even June, which I liked, and also her relationship with Eugene and the other criminals. And so you space this out, I think, quite well. Great paced story.
Yeah, I wasn't really interested in doing like a classic story where you go, like you see the bank and what's happening and the plan. There's a million story about that. So my main focus was really on what's happening next. And so the stories start right into the middle of the action. There's no introduction. It's pretty abrupt for the start.
Yeah, we really don't see the heists. Now, we do see some violence and things that would be considered crime, but that's a result or the aftermath of the initial heist.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in terms of this book, a new translation, an English translation, what kind of experience, if any, did you have with the translator of Bastard?
So the translator is me.
Oh, so you're the translator. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, because so like I did for Moose in the past, I worked a bit with Charles Forsman on this book because he published, I think, the first 3 chapters in English with Oily Comics. So it was like the 36 pages zines that he did, and but after that he was like too busy with everything else he has going on in his life, and so we just stopped making the publication. And so I had translated part of it, and then when I submitted to Fantagraphics, I wanted Eric Reynolds to be able to read it, because it makes more sense when you pitch a book. And so I translated everything, but with my English, which is not perfect. So they had that, and from that, Eric and the Fantagraphics team just twitch and work on a little bit on it to.
Okay, so you did the translation, but it was edited by the folks at Fantagraphics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I did notice that you thanked Forsman specifically at the very end of Bastard. So that's good that he provided you with the initial outlet for that.
Yeah, exactly. We have so I met him when I was in Right River Junction. I've been the fellow at CCS in 2009-10, and we were really close then, and we worked together on several publications when I was there, and I've been publishing him in French. So because I have a publishing house in Belgium, and I'm publishing his book, The End of the Fucking World, and the new one, I'm Not Okay With This. And and so he's been doing the same over here. He's been publishing my stuff, my zines, and so we work together.
Yeah. Have you seen that Netflix series, End of the Effing World?
Of course, everybody has seen it. It's crazy.
Yeah, I saw it. I guess it was a while after it came out. I watched the complete series. I guess it was about 2-3 months ago. And it's different from the graphic novel because it's set in England, and I think it's more decompressed of a story than in the graphic novel.
But it's funny because so I'm the publisher of the French version of the book, and we published it at the same time as Fantagraphics, so in 2013 or something like that. And the book didn't do as well as here in Europe. It was just like selling like slowly. So I think we sold like 700 copies in 5 years. And when the TV show came out, we were like, oh, we'll still have like 500 copies of this book. It's going to be okay. And like 2 weeks after, we don't have any book left. It was just like, my God, we need to reprint. Yeah. So yeah, we didn't expect the series to have such an impact and to be so popular.
Well, this is something that we didn't really get around to discussing when you were on the show a few months ago. But tell me about your experiences as a publisher. We've talked about you as an artist and writer, but what about the things that you do in comics as a publisher?
So, like most of the cartoonists, like indie cartoonists, I started doing zines. And so from there, pretty naturally, I started publishing. And so we have a small company with 5 other people. 4 of us are doing comics also, and one is really focused on publishing. But so we work together, and of course we don't have money to pay ourselves, so it's like most of the things, it's out of passion. And but we are able to pay the cartoonists for their work, and we don't publish that many books. We publish, I think, like between 5 and 7 books a year, and mostly French and Belgian cartoonists. And we have since I came here in 2010 and I met a lot of people in the US, and I have a strong connection with the work here. So we've been publishing a lot of cartoonists from the US. So we have John Porcelino, Charles Forsman, Alec Longstreth, Ron Regis Jr., Jordan Crane, Noah Van Cyver. So yeah, a lot of people.
Yeah, so basically, some of the key players, I would say, in the indie alternative field of comics here in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. And we have the same kind of authors for the French part.
Okay, so the French equivalent, the Belgian equivalent of these kind of indie creators here that you just mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And and so in Belgium next week, there's the Small Press Expo kind of festival convention. And we have a big exhibition, it's called Indie Americans, and we have all those people exhibited, so it's going to be nice. We have like 17 American cartoonists, we have originals from everyone, we have the original zines from everyone, okay. So it's going to be a big exhibition on indie cartooning in the US, in Brussels.
And you say it's a week from now as we record this?
A week from now, so I should be helping the others working on the exhibition, but I'm here.
Okay, so you're here now in Bethesda at Small Press Expo doing some publicity with Fantagraphics for the new book Bastard. Are you doing any other publicity either here in the U.S. or elsewhere for the new English translation?
I won't be able to because so I'm here just for the weekend, and then I go back to Brussels. Because my wife is very, very pregnant, so I'm very, very. Yeah, very, very. It's like in a few weeks now, and by 3-4 weeks, she'll have a second kid. So it's not a time where I can just travel around. Even coming here, I was a bit stressed about, but it's okay.
So you can get a phone call any minute now that something's coming a little early.
Don't tell me that. That would be terrible.
I don't want to jinx you. No. I was in a similar situation with our firstborn in that we were living in West Lafayette, Indiana at the time, and I had a conference scheduled for Greensboro, North Carolina, and I felt really wigged out the entire weekend because I thought at any moment something could happen.
Yeah, we had a small alert at the last week. We spent the night in the emergency and everything. And so it was too early for the baby to come. So we're a bit stressed out, but everything settled down. But so now being here, I'm a bit like, I'm checking my phone all the time. And but yeah, it's okay. It's going to be fine.
Okay. So when you were on the show a few months ago and we talked about Ouija and I asked you, what are you working on now or what are the new things that you have coming out? You were telling me about Bastard. So I'm going to ask you a similar question now that Bastard is out. Is there anything that you're currently working on that you can tell us about or that we can look forward to in the very near future?
Yeah, so I have actually quite a lot of things coming out in the US this year. I'm going to have a another book with Fantagraphics called Obo Mom. It's a book I did with Karl Forsman that we
Called what again?
Obo Mom.
Obo Mom?
Yeah, like a hobo.
Hobo Mom. Okay.
Sorry, Hobo Mom. Yeah. It's a book we wrote and drew with Chuck. So it's we both worked on the story and both drew in every panel. So it's really a mix of both our drawings. And so that book came out a while back in Italian and French, and now it's going to come out with Fantagraphics sometime 2019. I don't know when, but sometime. I have another book coming out with a conundrum also called Simon and Louise. It's a YA comics. And I'm working on a 3-part series, also YA comics in Belgium. So I'm working on the third one now. It's called Stig and Tild, and it's also been signed by a publisher here. So it should come in 2020, something like that.
Okay, so you mentioned these two young adult works. Is that a direction that you find yourself going into now, is writing for younger readers?
So I've been doing that. Sorry. And in French, I've been doing that since the beginning. I've kind of alternated between graphic novels like for adult and then comics, like more YA comics. So usually I try to do like one of each, go back and forth. Because I think it's different here, but in Belgium it feels like children for kids is not very considered. Like people just think it's garbage, so they just write whatever, and it's usually pretty stupid, and there's a lot of cliche and stereotype, like girls are stupid. The jokes are really kind of like, I always compare comics for kids in Belgium for like when you have a family dinner and there's an uncle who's always a bit drunk and he says like jokes that are on the border of being racist and stuff, and you're just like, I don't want to be here. And for me, like, kids comics in Belgium are a bit like that. Okay. So I've been trying to work on stories where I talk about being a teenager, and I try to talk to them as equal, not like I try to talk about everything, trying to talk about sex, trying to talk about violence, and not censor myself and not think that they are stupid and then they cannot deal with something hard. So yeah, I've been working on that since 2009, I think. So I have a lot of YA comics in French.
Yeah. And I know one of the things I remember us discussing a few months ago when Ouija came out is your book Moose, which I think many in the U.S., especially those I think with the Eisner Awards, thought that was a book for younger readers, but you and I didn't necessarily see it that way. Yeah,
and exactly. And Bastard is the same. Like for me, Bastard is a book for adults, but it won the college prize in Angoulême. So like kids from the age of 15 voted for the best book of the year, and that was my book. So I guess it's also, it could be a YA books.
Yeah, well, I guess given this phenomena that it's read as both adult and for younger readers, on the upside of that, broad audience potential.
Yeah, and, and it's also, I think because I've been doing all those YA comics that are focused on that, now they're able also to, when they see something of mine, they're like, oh, this the guy who did those YA books, and so they pick them up and they read it as if it was YA, and they don't, of course they can read it. I mean, there's no problem for me. Yeah.
Well, Max, it's very nice to meet you in person now and to talk with you again for the podcast, and I wish you the best of luck with this new book, the English translation of Bastard.
Thank you very much.
Here at Small Press Expo, I had the pleasure of finally meeting in person Ryan Holmberg. For listeners of the podcast, especially our monthly manga show, that name definitely should be familiar because Shay and I talk about a lot of books that Ryan has translated and edited. Especially lately, we've been looking at a good number of your works. Ryan, how's SPX going for you?
There are many
That's good. I'm here to give a talk in the afternoon about an artist named Baron Yoshimoto. There's a book out from Retrofit called The Troublemakers. We're talking about his relationship to fashion industry and men's fashion in the 1960s. And other than that, just here to meet people like Derek.
Yeah. Yeah, and we discussed The Troublemakers several months back. And that was just a phenomenal book. That was one of the highlights of the year so far, I think. So you did a really good job with that book. And also, I have to say that I appreciate your essay at the end. It's a thoughtful, critical, scholarly essay without being steeped in the kind of academies that many critical, scholarly essays are. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. Actually, a couple other people have said the same thing about that essay, which is kind of weird because for me, it's an essay I had to write really fast and kind of under duress and pressure from other things. But somehow that made it flow more easily. But yeah, I hope people like the book, introducing a well-known artist in Japan but unknown entity in English. So that book's out. And because of that book, the artist, Baron Yoshimoto, who he's mainly a painter now. He doesn't do comics. He's probably having a painting exhibition in LA maybe next year. So that book has generated some interest even outside the comics world.
Yeah. I wasn't familiar with Baron Yoshimoto's work until I think Jared at Retrofit Big Planet told me about it, I don't know, several months before publication. I said, who? So, yeah, I was really pleased with that volume, as well as with the recent Slumwolf, that you did actually similar things, right? You translated those stories, you pulled them all together, and then you included a very informative essay at the end.
Yeah, I was happy about Slumwolf. It's kind of a sequel to a book that I did with Drawn and Quarterly about 4 years ago, called Trash Market. And that, kind of a story there was that, Trash Market was supposed to come out from Picture Box initially, and then Picture Box stopped publishing, so that book migrated to D&Q, and then New York Review of Comics came about, started doing their things, and because of my books with Picture Box, they were interested in doing something manga-related, so Slumwolf came about through that, and the next book that I'm working on with New York Review of Comics is by Tsuge Tado's elder and more famous brother named Tsuge Yoshiharu. So a work that he wrote in the 1980s called The Man Without Talents. We'll be starting production on that in a couple months. And I'm not sure when it's supposed to be out, but it will be out within a year.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, and I'm really interested because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if there's any translation in English of his works.
There are two short stories. One came out in a volume of the Comics Journal, the print edition, I believe around the year 2000. And then there's also a short story in one of the issues of Raw, back from the 80s or early 90s maybe.
But not a book, not a collection of stories or a longer form narrative.
And there hadn't been anything in any language until a few years ago. I think something in Spanish or Italian or maybe French was the first. But recently, Tsuge Yoshiharu, traditionally, he very closeted, introverted person and wasn't too interested in dealing with non-Japanese publishers. But recently, he's become more open to the idea. And so now kind of the floodgates are opening because D&Q will also be doing a number of volumes of Tsuge Yoshiharu's work in the next 3 or 4 years.
Really? So you think it's because his shyness and his withdrawnness that we haven't seen really any books in English from him?
Yeah, I mean, he's been... people have pitched projects to him over and over again. I've met him a number of times and trying to get him motivated. I think part of the reason that the English editions finally came out is because I've met him a number of times. I speak Japanese, and he felt that someone knew his brother's work, knew other Garo artists' work, knew Japanese well. So he kind of trusted that his work would be well represented in English.
Oh, okay, yeah, because he's a legendary figure, and it's a little surprising that none of his work, outside of those two stories, as you mentioned, have not been translated into English.
No, I know it's funny that it took this long to happen. and just knowing, a lot of the details about the backstory of how this happened. How it happened was also fairly messy, but I'm happy that it turned out after all.
Now, you mentioned that, you've seen him a number of times, and I think that's one of the things I've gathered from your work is that you do seem to have these close relationships with the Japanese creators, which seems to help, not only the work in terms of getting out, but also the various volumes that you're involved in. And you had mentioned before we turned on the mic that you're currently staying in Durham right now, but you normally live in Japan, correct?
Right. I'm on a 2 to 3 year teaching gig at the University of Tokyo. I'm about to start the second year next week. The Japanese school year starts. I'm starting my second year teaching there next week. So I'm there. I was just back in Durham to visit friends, and yeah.
Okay. So tell me about your relationship with many of these creators, some very classic big names in manga history. How do you meet these individuals? Through publishers, through academic events? Do you just go up and say, hey, how you doing? Let me introduce myself.
Well, most of the artists I've had contact with are of an older generation, so sometimes their productivity has dropped off in the last 20 years. So, they're kind of legendary figures, but not necessarily figures who are out and about in the world active anymore. But my main contact was through one editor. His name is Mitsuhiro Asakawa. Asakawa was crucial for a lot of D&Q's early manga volumes. He was involved in A Drifting Life by Tatsumi Yoshihiro. He's been involved in some of the other books that they've done by like Oji Suzuki and Susumu Katsumata. Those are basically books that he edited and did in Japanese that subsequently came out in English. But I got in touch with him maybe 15 years ago, and he started introducing me to older artists because he was an editor at Garo, and then went on to co-found Axe, which was Garo's successor magazine, which is still around. And he also speaks English and French and is in contact with, foreign agents. So, yeah, I contacted him, and he started slowly introducing me to different artists over the years.
Now, you're particularly drawn to more, I guess older creators, more classic, more, I guess we would call alternative, definitely not, at least in the U.S., we would call mainstream manga creators, mangaka. What do you make of the popularity of manga in the United States compared to Japan, especially when it comes to, let's say, the non-popular stuff like One Piece and other such titles? Or is that too broad a question?
No, it's good. Obviously, I'm sometimes amazed by how much people who don't speak English know about manga that's only in Japanese. But that said, most people's understanding of what manga is outside of Japan is dictated by what gets translated, especially in the stuff I work on. So I can definitely see how things are skewed. And I know also how my selections also contribute to that skewing. So while I'll keep doing the kind of books that I have been doing, hoping to branch out in different ways in the next coming years. The next upcoming projects that I talked about earlier, those will probably keep me in the straight and narrow of working on men from Garo. But starting to branch out into a couple women artists in the next couple of years. There'll be a big show at the the Honolulu Museum of Art in, I believe, 2020 of women manga artists. So I am trying to organize a couple translations in support of that.
Now, will they be, let's say, single author volumes or perhaps an anthology?
Single author volumes.
Okay.
I wouldn't mind doing an anthology. The thing is that doing an anthology is a real pain because you have to, organize the artwork, the data, and the rights of multiple artists. And it's already a pain in the ass enough to get one person on board. So just for organizational sake, if I were to ever do a multi-artist anthology, I wouldn't want to be the person doing the agent work on that.
What are some of the biggest challenges you find as a translator? Not so much as an editor, but as a translator with manga.
I'd just say the translation's fairly easy once you have a certain level of Japanese. I would say that probably the hardest part on the translation is actually the English side, in the sense that you want it to sound, because most of the text is in speech balloons, you want them to sound chatty in a natural way. I sometimes, and not as much as I should, reference older American comics or, kind of well-worded graphic novels that are out today to try to find a better comics voice in English. Because, mainly when I write, it's mainly academic or quasi-academic historical stuff. It's not dialogue. So I think I need to practice more being a better dialogue writer.
And I know that in terms of your work as an editor, one of the things that Shay and I commented on, or at least speculated on, with both the Troublemakers and more recently with Slum Wolf, is the arrangement of the stories, which aren't necessarily in chronological order. And I know that both Shay and I have tried to kind of guess, okay, so what was Ryan Holmberg thinking when he arranged the stories in this way? I think you actually, on Instagram, addressed that question that we posed when it came to Slum Wolf.
So a lot of Slum Wolf work by an artist named Tsuge Tado. A lot of his work, it has an unfinished quality to it. A lot of open-ended stories, which wasn't too rare amongst his peers at the time. It was kind of a style of literary short-form manga. But in addition to that, a number of his stories are, in fact, unfinished. And he keeps kind of returning to the same themes and characters, almost to the point of redrawing the same comic over and over again. So there's a couple of famous works that he had that are also good in segments, but are unfinished, that I wanted to include in the translation. And they're in Slum Wolf. The one that's really unfinished is called Vagabond Plain.
Right.
So, it's how do you bury that unfinished quality? Because in a way there's a continuity with the characters and the atmosphere and the setting. So it's how do you tie in that unfinished quality and make it seem intentional or not obtrusive, but also kind of built that into an atmosphere of the anthology.
Well, I think you were really successful in doing that. And I was also interested in your essay at the end, your comments, not that favorable, about the film, quote-unquote, adaptation of Vagabond Plain.
I mean, the director who did a film adaptation of Tsuge Tado's work also did, I think, 2 film adaptations of his brother Tsugiyoshi Haru's work. And I believe both of those 2 are kind of compendia of fragments of different stories. So even though the title is after a specific work by the artists, they're more kind of a collage of various narrative segments from the work and to create a kind of aura around the artist's worldview.
Okay. So now you were telling us about some of the projects that you're currently at work on. What is the next book that we can expect?
In print?
Yes.
So the next book in print, and this is the last thing that's actually on its way, that's been on its way to finishing, is another book by Breakdown Press, artist Yuichi Yokoyama, a well-known avant-garde manga artist who his first publications all came out through Picture Box, Travel, Garden, New Engineering, and then...
that Retrofit had that volume, Iceland from last year, yeah.
So that's out. And then Breakdown is doing a work, it's about 10 years old now, but it's still very fresh, called Outdoors. And that will be coming out, I believe, in November. It'll debut at CAB, Comic Art Brooklyn.
Okay, and again, that's a Breakdown title.
That's a Breakdown title.
Okay, and I'm sure it's something that we'll discuss on the manga series. Well, Ryan, it was wonderful to meet you finally in person after corresponding with you on social media and email for the past couple of years. And, hey, thanks for the time. Good luck with the panel. It's at, 4:30? Right. Yeah, I've got an interview lined up at 4. I don't know if I can make it, but if I am, I'll be down there in the room.
Well, it'll eventually be, I think all their talks are on YouTube eventually, so you can check it out there. But, yeah, thank you.
Okay, listeners of the podcast probably have heard recently my interview with Kyler Roberts. I had the opportunity to do an interview with her, which lasted about an hour. That was about a week ago as I'm recording this. Now, I'm at Small Press Expo 2018 right now, and I am at Kyler and her husband Scott's table. And right now, though, I'm talking with Scott Roberts because I want to find out more about his comics. How you doing, Scott?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
Okay, now, I think I was talking to you earlier about where you guys are located. You're by one of the front entrances, so you're getting a lot of traffic.
Yes, sir. W69A. Lots of people here, lots of traffic. It's great. Actually, it's a really huge SPX.
Yeah. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting you for the first time yesterday. A bunch of us went out to dinner, so it's funny because when I approached you and Kyler, I immediately knew who you were because of Kyler's comics.
Yeah, I play a character in her comics. I think kind of the lead role.
Yeah. And, one of the things I talked with Kyler about on that interview last week was her thoughts of using, your daughter Zia in her comics, which she's not doing as much right now as I guess she used to. But let me ask you, how does it feel for you to be a character in her comics?
Well, it's pretty great. I mean, people know me without having to introduce myself, so it's really great. And she puts me in a very good light. She uses all of my best lines, and I mean sometimes she steals them, but mostly she gives me really good lines, so people know who I am, and it's really great in comics society because people already know me. Although it's weird I'm a fictional character.
Yeah, but she does handle you with love.
Yes, yeah, no, and she also. She checks things with me. So, like, sometimes she misquotes me and we have discussions about what I actually said.
In fact, just this morning I was looking through my copy of Chlorine Gardens and saw a strip where you're not feeling well and you got a stomach ache, and she asks you if I think you ate something that you shouldn't have, and she has you responding, no, yes.
Well, it's funny because I don't usually tell her when I have stomach problems because that bothers her. She hates to hear that other people have problems with their stomach because it makes her feel sick. So generally I have to kind of cover those up.
So empathic stomach aches.
Yes.
Now I want to talk with you about your work because, I don't recall, and maybe it's there, but I don't remember seeing anything in her comics about you also being an artist, a comics artist. So when I met you yesterday and gathered that, hey, you're doing this stuff as well, and you're tabling with her, I became interested. So introduce me and our listeners to your comics work.
Well, my comics, I think it fits into the art comics world where it's much more about visual experimentation. That's the higher priority than narrative or traditional storytelling comics. There's often a story involved, but mostly it's about the image, and that's the kind of work that really interests me.
Okay, so what are some of the titles that you have up here?
Well, my latest work is called Body Magic, and others are Supermodel and Hound in the Mush, and a flip book I made, which is both a flip book and it's a narrative. And then I also have an anthology which I put together and edited called Loving Richards Valley, which the proceeds all go to the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society, featuring huge name cartoonists.
Yeah, I'm looking at the back of it now. You had pointed this out to me before we turned on the mic. Jessica Campbell, Kevin Zapp, Simon Hasselman, Eleanor Davis, I think, is in here, Kyler as well, Noah Van Sciver. Your daughter is a creator, Tommy Parrish, Jesse Jacobs. This is in many ways kind of a who's who of indie and alternative comics.
Yeah, well, these are a lot of the people whose work I really admire and also friends of mine. And they are also big fans of Michael DeForge's online strip, Leaving Richards Valley. So I got the idea actually last SPX because we were talking about the strip, and I thought, it'd be great to do this and then raise money for charity of Michael's choice. So he's very interested in the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society. So we put it together. Nobody's getting any money from it, and we also donated the paper and the ink as well, and I do all the printing myself.
Okay.
So we've raised over $2,000 so far.
Now, did this just recently come out, Loving Richards Valley?
Yeah, we had some copies at TCAF, but this is really the debut.
Okay. And you say your latest comic is Body Magic, but then you have some of the other titles here. I see, the Hound and the Mush?
Yes, that's my first comic from about 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay. And then, Supermodel?
Yes.
Yeah. So what distinguishes, let's say, Supermodel from Body Magic, or are they somewhat similar in approach? You were describing more art comics?
Yeah, I mean, they're similar in that I experiment with image and combination of image and narrative, but they're very different in both content and... Supermodel has no narrative, really. I mean, it's sort of a loose narrative. It's more about imagery, and Body Magic is a story, but I'm not really sure how easy it is to follow.
Yeah. Okay, so you do self-publishing. What are some of the challenges of self-publishing that you have found?
It's hard to get your work out there without a publisher. A publisher does a lot of the work of promoting, so you have to do your own promotion. So that's an extra job. But, I do it I don't do it for money. I do it because I really love the medium and I love the arts comics community. So that's the main driver for me.
So if someone wanted to find out more about your comics, where would they go online? Where would they go to social media?
My website is ubutopia.com, ubutopia.com.
Okay. And what are you working on now, right, Scott?
I'm working on a book that will hopefully be done for the Comic Arts Brooklyn and also the Chicago Art Book Fair in November.
What can you tell us about it?
It'll be colorful and pretty abstract.
Okay. Well, good luck with that, and thank you for introducing me to your comics, because, obviously I'm familiar with Kyler's, but this is a great find, and good luck with not only your work, but also this Loving Richards Valley anthology.
Great. Thank you, Derek.
I'm here with Nathan Gelgud. He has a new book that I guess this weekend just recently debuted, and that is this weekend? Yeah. House in the Jungle. Nathan, nice to meet you.
Hi, Derek.
Yeah. So for those who may not have, let's say, pre-ordered a copy or know what A House in the Jungle is about, what is the synopsis, the summary? Without giving anything away.
It's about a hermit who lives in the jungle and farms pineapples. He sells them in the nearby town, and throughout the course of the book, the relationship between the hermit and the town grows increasingly strained, and he's simultaneously on a metaphysical quest trying to see things in other dimensions.
But these are not your run-of-the-mill pineapples, though.
Well, that's, as the book develops, you start to see that maybe something is a little bit different about these pineapples. I'm not sure that anybody involved in the story itself knows exactly what it is that's different about them, but that drives some of the action, certainly.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I appreciated about The House in the Jungle is the ambiguity that you've baked into the narrative, in that, we know some things about the protagonist, the hermit, but we don't know a lot about his background, why he is in the situation that he's in, what he's looking for. You mentioned the metaphysical journey, but also those pineapples. We don't know a lot about them or their nature or genesis, and I like storytelling that does leave a lot of really intriguing questions open.
Yeah, thank you for appreciating that. I'm not sure that every reader really goes for that part of the book. I think that, you brought up Daniel's backstory and the lack of it. I kind of toyed with the idea of figuring that out or writing some of that in there, but I think that for this book, it was best to tell the story as if you're just watching the events happen, and not put any explanations in there that weren't organic to exchanges that characters would actually have. So while I might know more about what I think is happening, if there wasn't a natural way in the story for that to come out through what you're looking at or the words that you're reading in speech bubbles, I chose just not to put it in there. And I think that hopefully it shows. I think that when a writer or an artist or an author knows themselves what happened, you don't necessarily need to tell the reader everything, because it'll hold together because of its own internal logic. And I'm glad that Annie Koyama felt the same way and decided to publish it.
Yeah. This is coming out from Koyama Press, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is this your first long-form narrative?
This is my first graphic novel, yes.
Okay. So now I have seen many of the comics that you have on your website, and those are short in nature. Another thing that struck me about those online works is that many of them are based on fairly well-known literary and cultural figures like Malcolm X, especially Walt Whitman. And I'm wondering how your previous comics that are available online, and even Woody Allen, by the way, I'm a big Woody Allen fan, so I was especially pleased to see that strip. And that you didn't really focus any, as you point out, on the whole Mia Farrow debacle. But what was the transition like going from those kind of online comics into something quite different, House in the Jungle?
I don't know how different it really is. And it wasn't really going from one to the other. I worked on House in the Jungle for 4 or 5 years. The comics that you're talking about, which are mostly literary or historical in nature, those are commissioned works. I make my living as an illustrator, and I'm lucky enough to do a lot of work for Penguin Random House's online presence. So a lot of that stuff is tied to book coverage, or like the Walt Whitman thing you mentioned. I think it was like his 150th, I don't remember, but it was some big birthday of his. I also do work for the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and they had a show inspired by Walt Whitman. So that's why you saw a great wealth of Whitman material on there, in addition to the fact that I'm a fan. You asked about the transition. I guess the difference is that, one is based in research, where you're inheriting the material and you're figuring out how to interpret it. And the fictional book is figuring out how to take ideas and images that have only existed so far in your mind and translate them. You have to figure out what they look like. Right. I know what Walt Whitman looks like. I have to figure out how I want to draw him. A protagonist in the book, I kind of see him in my head, and then I have to get it on the page somehow.
Now, you mentioned that you were working on House in the Jungle for about 4 years. What is the genesis of that project? Where did you first begin thinking about this fictional story?
It was a dream that I had. It's based on a dream, and in my own belief that there is a possibility to perceive extrasensory things that we're currently unaware of.
So part of the narratives, as you put it, kind of the metaphysical nature of that, is linked to its origins as a dream?
Yeah. I can't remember the dream anymore. I think it was a vision of a guy in a jungle who encounters some dead animals. And then where the dream started to turn into, taking notes on how it would work as a narrative, I'm not sure. But I had this idea of a guy in a jungle, and he encounters some dead animals, and he's got to figure out what to do about it. And then the things that he finds sort of gets weirder and escalates. And then I sort of went to do the book. I sort of went back the other direction. I said, okay, well, what if it started with something what if it didn't start with dead animals? What if it just started with like garbage or something like that?
Now, are you someone who keeps a dream diary, or who notes your dreams when you wake up as soon as you start remembering them?
No, but I wish I did. Which is a weird thing to say, because what's stopping you, right?
Laziness for me.
Maybe. Close friend of mine, Chris, couldn't believe that I didn't do that. Maybe I should, but I don't know. I mean, I had a dream and it turned into a book without a dream journal, so.
That's interesting. So, are you currently at work on any other either shorter strip or maybe another long form work?
I'd love to continue the story of Daniel and House in the Jungle. There's nothing on paper yet, but there are notes and it's in my head. And I've got tons of other ideas for what I'd like to do.
Okay. So this is something that once we get to the end, I didn't think about this, but this is once we get to the end of A House in the Jungle, you see this as the potential for a sequel.
I mean, I think it works completely as its own book. And I don't ever want to do a book or a comic that, where I'm not putting something on the page that I think has to exist. So this isn't a case of me feeling like, oh, what more can I do with this guy? But after the book ends, I started to see maybe what would happen to him. I had some images come to me about another world he might find himself in and some things that he might get up to. So we'll see what happens. I think that it could intersect nicely with a lot of the other things that I'm thinking about right now about economics and politics. So I hope to get the opportunity to do it.
So if our listeners want to check out your work, not just this new book from Koyama Press, but also the stuff that you've made available online, where do they go?
You can go to nathangelgud.com. My last name's Gelgud. There you can find a lot of the work that I do, both as an illustrator and as a comics maker. And you can also find the movie-themed tote bags that I make on Etsy.
Okay. And then your presence on social media?
I'm on Instagram, which is mostly where I post stuff. It's just my last name, Gelgud, Gelgud.
Okay. Nathan, really nice book, and I recommend that our listeners, check this out. Thank you very much for taking the time and talking with me, and I hope you have a successful rest of Small Press Expo.
Derek, I appreciate it.
I have the pleasure of talking with M. Dean. Her new book, I Am Young, is, I guess, debuting at SPX. Technically, but it comes out later this fall, correct?
Yeah, sometime in November.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to have seen a copy of it earlier before it came out because I really enjoyed the book. Yeah. And in fact, I was first introduced to your work, I think it was back in 2015, KM and RO in 1971, because it was nominated for, Promising New Talent?
Yeah.
An Ignatz?
I forgot about that. Yeah, it was nominated, and I don't think I was there that year, so even if I could promote myself, I wasn't there too, but it's nice.
And I think we may have corresponded around that time because we did a special episode of the Ignatz nominees, and I tried to get me and my co-host copies of as many of the nomination titles as possible, and I think you were kind enough to send me a copy of that, and I was bowled away by it.
Yeah, I remember that now. Once I saw the name of the podcast, I remembered sending it over.
That's that annoying guy who contacted me 3 years ago.
No, I don't think anyone contacted me is never annoying. I don't have friends, so anyone who talks to me is very exciting.
So, I mentioned that story. That is included in this new book, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of the middle piece. It's not the main story at this point. It's kind of blossomed out in the past 3 years now, but I guess it's technically the one that started the book because that's the first one I did, and then since I had to complete everything and push it further, it became all these other short stories, and they just kind of thematically linked up. So
yeah, and also there are other stories of your short pieces that are available on your website that are also chapters, I guess we could call them, in the new book, I Am Young.
Yeah, technically, most of the short comics work I've done is in the book, except for a couple things that I think are actually a bit older and just don't have the relevancy to the themes or whatever. There's a lot of new ones too, though, because I got the Creators for Creators grant, which is why I am even here now. But I did 60 or so new pages of content. I don't remember how many more stories I did at this point, 3 or 4. And There's a lot more now.
Now, the book will be coming out, I guess, wide release in early or mid-November. So many of our listeners may not have had the opportunity to check it out now, unless they're attending SPX and can get a copy. And we actually did mention the solicit on a recent episode of the Comics Alternative because it was listed in the September previews catalog. And we emphasize the Beatles aspect of it because both my co-host for that show and I are big Beatles fans. But for those who don't know your book yet, I Am Young, how would you lay out its premise?
I would say it's very musically minded. I know in like a lot of the marketing, or at least like the back of the book description is kind of like Beatles heavy because there's a central story that gets revisited that's like the exterior kind of theme is really the Beatles and like our relationship to pop culture, especially when it's something as famous as the Beatles. But like, I don't like celebrating anything. I just like to look at and analyze how it affects us. And that's how I view it. I mean, I grew up with the Beatles and I liked them a lot too. I have baby boomer parents, so I had no choice. But I would say it's more about being young and making mistakes and just like trying to figure out your life. I guess you could call it coming of age, but I try to go a little more insular and like interior lives of the characters in it. So it's not about them finding some solution to their lives or becoming an adult. It's about this moment in their time when they're, still struggling and figuring things out, but I wouldn't say there's really a resolution to most of the stories. They just keep going, like aging, like we all do.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you described it the way that you did, because one of the things that struck me when I read I Am Young is how different my impression was after finishing than my impression was in reading the black back cover blurb or the solicit in the previews catalog. Because according to the blurb or the solicit, it does seem like it's going to be heavily Beatles influenced. But you sprinkle the Beatle references fairly lightly throughout the narrative. So I used to write copy for publishers, so I know that there's an art to it and there's certain things that you have to play up. And that's obviously what happened with I Am Young, but it's much more than just some kind of nostalgic tip of the hat, so to speak, to the Beatles.
I love doing historical fiction. I like looking back into the 20th century for inspiration and source material, but like I said, I don't choose to celebrate anything. I'm not nostalgic as a person. I love throwing things away as much as I love collecting things. So, like I said, I think it's great copy. I didn't write it and I wanted them to write it in a way they could sell it. But, it's more complex than, just, hey, remember this thing? Isn't it great? If you follow along with all the different stories, they all have kind of like a musician or artist or album or whatever that they're connected to. Just
like Tom Jones, the Carpenters, ELO.
Oh, I love ELO so much. So they all have their own thread. This, like, the main one just happens to be the Beatles, because at a certain point, it's like, I want to tie this all book together, and I have all these other musical references, and I've been wanting to do something about Beatlemania as a concept for a long time, just because it's interesting to me to look back on it that way. And so Greyfriars Bobby is just what came out of that.
And you mentioned earlier that there is an ongoing storyline woven throughout the book where the Beatles are important. And this is the relationship between Miriam and George, right?
Yeah. So George and Miriam's story is 4 parts. It's scattered throughout the book. So each story begins... The whole book is arranged chronologically, so you have a story in the 50s and it ends 2001. So they're scattered throughout with Greyfriars Bobby, and each of their stories begins with a significant event, quote unquote, and like the Beatles timeline. Again, heavy air quotes there. Just because it's a way to tie everything together. It's like what would you call it? Like a marker. Mm-hmm. And of course, especially the Beatles and like John Lennon's death and etc. I feel like there's such a play up with the Beatles timeline, like that you don't get so much with other bands or groups, just because everyone was listening to them and following them, and you know when they broke up, you know when John Lennon died, you know when George Harrison died. Mm-hmm. So that just seems like a significant way to like choose when these characters interacted again, because they're together because of the pop culture, and they're together again each time an event related to that pop culture thing comes up.
Yeah, and there is something moving and quite bittersweet about the relationship between Miriam and George, because we do get to see, I guess, the evolution, as you mentioned, in 4 parts of their relationship, and where each of those installments is anchored, let's say, within the Beatles' history. So when they first come on the scene, when they break up, interestingly enough, it becomes a theme for that particular installment, breakup, and then we get the death of John, George, but you also reference, let's say, other, or at least visually reference, a variety of solo works. So I was particularly interested in the way that you handled and included an image of McCartney 2.
Yeah, actually, a lot of those later album covers I included for like the title markers I've never listened to, and I don't really want to. Mm-hmm. But again, like I like drawing album covers. I've done a lot of projects where I just like, pop art style recreated them, just because they're significant to me, my life and history, to like see the album art itself. And a lot of the other stories already had that in them. So I just, it's a natural thing to have this like 4-beat pattern with the 4 Beatles, 4 album covers, 4 panels per row on each page of that story. And then, it was just natural to include those all together. There's not like a whole lot of significance to them, but I think it works.
Yeah. And you mentioned your love of drawing album covers. You have on your website, I think it's called Record Closet, which is how do you describe it, as a poster comic that has an image or a representation of a variety of different, mostly famous album covers.
Yeah, that was a project I did several years ago, where I looked through our old family record closet back in my home and chose albums that I remember specifically talking about with my parents or listening to, or just whatever reason that they stand out in my memory. So I wanted to recreate them because that project originally came from a place of grief. I think it kind of happened because I was dealing with the death of my father. So I was doing that and trying to recreate the memories and, remember him in some way that like was significant in my life. And from there, like, since I did that, I've really enjoyed doing that. I don't know if it's just like the sick thrill of recreating something that already exists and like, wow, I drew it and it looks just like the thing. I'm good at art. Or something like that. I don't know. I get some kind of thrill out of seeing the logo reproduced in art somehow. Maybe I just like pop art too much.
Yeah. Well, coming back to the new book, you were describing what we could call the main storyline, the relationship between Miriam and George. But along the way, as you point out, there are a variety of other relationships. And if I'm not mistaken, each of these other stories are kind of like one-shots, right? So we get a relationship at one point, but that's all we get of it. So it's not like a return to Miriam and George in that way. One of the things, though, that struck me is that you do string these stories, both Miriam and George's, and then the other couples, together in a way that they're really nicely linked. Obviously the music reference. You also mentioned the chronological nature. We start in the 1950s and end up in 2001, but also the relationships that are woven throughout. And so it strikes me that I Am Young can be described as something like a story cycle where you have individual stories that could stand on their own, but when you put them together, they resonate in a way that makes things a little more complete. So it's like a novel in sections, or again, what in prose literary studies is called the short story cycle, or what I call in comics the graphic cycle. Were you maybe from the beginning thinking in those terms, or did I Am Young kind of evolve into something like a graphic cycle?
I think it definitely evolved. The first KM and RP was just kind of, something I did because I had the idea and I needed to do something for my thesis. So I did that.
So that was a thesis work?
Yeah, it was. And I got it printed up through RA Comics Direct, just a plug, because they saved my butt a lot of times because I don't know how to make anything. But so I started with that one, and then as I moved out of college and into New York City and, having my life, I just started getting other ideas, and they kept being stories about teenagers or like related in some way to young people. And once I created like 2 or 3, it's like, oh wait, I'm getting a theme here. So like once that emerged, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how to do it. Like once I finished, I think Strange Magic or Baby Fat is like, well, now I need to find a way to make this a bigger book because I have all these other ideas. And then like I knew exactly how I wanted to do it for like the past 2 years, maybe. Okay. I just needed the time and the resources to do it, like we all do.
Okay. Now, I know that you've just, or I guess relatively recently, finished I Am Young. It's going to be coming out wide release in November. But I have to ask you, what other projects might you be working on right now that you can tell us about?
Currently, I just have my webcomics, The Girl Who Flew Away and coming soon, Regent's Walk. There's another book of short stories I am hoping to do in collaboration with my partner. We haven't gotten the wheels moving too much in that. It's interesting in this case because we basically have it all plotted out. We know the different stories we're thinking of doing. So it's from the get-go, it's a lot more planned than I Am Young. It's just a matter of actually trying it at this point, which is, it'll come in its own time.
Now, I've referenced your website during our interview. If people wanted to find out more about your work, your webcomics, as well as some of the other material that you've created, where would they go?
Everything is mdeancomics.com.
That's one word. Everything is mdeancomics.com.
Yeah, not with everything, but all my illustration work, all my other smaller comic works that aren't included in the book are on the website, and it has links to my webcomics in the top.
Okay, so again, that URL is
mdeancomics.com.
Okay, so not the everything. I got a mistake there. So people can find out more about your work that way. Get your new book, I Am Young, in November if they're not attending SPX. And Em, I really do appreciate the time that you've taken to talk with me. I've liked your work for, ever since I saw it several years ago, and it's good to see this longer form text about to be released.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It's nice to have a nice big book proof that I did anything with my life. And I've never done a podcast thing before.
Oh, you have? This is your first?
Yeah, it's my first because it actually gives me a hell of a lot of anxiety to have my voice recorded, so I probably won't re-listen it till later, but it was really fun just blabbing on about my thoughts and stuff because I don't know, I haven't had a chance to talk about it a lot yet.
Okay. Well, when your next book comes out, then we'll have to have you on the podcast for a more proper interview where I can maybe talk with you on Skype for about an hour.
Yeah, that sounds fun too. I've been on Skype for hours on end, so it's definitely doable.
Okay. Nice talking to you, and I recommend that our listeners, when available, get a copy of I Am Young, especially if they're interested in music and relationships.
Yeah, it's got all that good gay stuff, too, so. All right. Thank you for having me, too.
Thanks, Em.
Thanks.
One of our favorite publishers on the Comics Alternative is Kilgore Books and Comics. And Dan Stafford, the publisher, is really good at letting us know when new material comes out. And right now I'm standing in front of one of Kilgore's creators, Emi Gennis. Now, I think last year, I guess I was introduced to your work through the book that came out last year, The Plunge, A True Story. And then with the latest batch from Kilgore, you have another work, Baseline Boulevard. Emi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Fine. How has SPX this year been for you so far?
SPX is great for me every year. It's my favorite show.
So, and we did discuss The Plunge on an episode of the Comics Alternative, but for those who, and shame on them, didn't catch that episode, because it was a publisher spotlight on Kilgore books from that season, how would you describe The Plunge?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you because I did hear that episode, and you are one of the only people that I have heard cover my work and pronounce my name correctly, Emi Gennis.
How do they usually pronounce it?
Gennis, which is incorrect. But anyway, so The Plunge is a true story of Annie Edson Taylor, the first person to survive going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And most of my work is nonfiction. I'm very focused on history, so that tends to be where I gravitate. And Annie's story is really depressing, but also sort of inspiring because of this woman doing this amazing, ridiculous thing.
Okay, so then we have the new book, Baseline Boulevard.
Also kind of depressing. That one's a memoir. Again, I entirely make nonfiction, mostly history, some journalism, but occasionally I will delve into autobio.
So this was such a foray, Baseline Boulevard, an autobiography or memoir.
Sure. I hadn't done autobio work in a really long time. I started out, like many cartoonists, making autobio work, and most of it was very humor-based. And then when I returned to autobio for Baseline Boulevard, it was distinctly not humor-based at all. It was actually a challenge that I set out to myself. I like to, with every new book, set myself a new goal to learn or to teach myself some new thing about comics and try to progress my work. So with this one, I wanted to try to step back from making my work really text heavy. I feel like I tend to do a lot of research and cram every single fact into my work. And so with doing an autobio piece, I already know that I can't cram every fact into that work because I know every single thing about it, and there's no way that I can communicate that to my audience. So rather than trying to tell something that is the factual truth, I really tried to emphasize in that piece telling something that was more of an emotional truth. Not that it's not a true story, but I didn't put pressure on myself to explain every element of it, which was an interesting challenge.
Okay. So, what is it about, let's say, historical writing or journalism or even autobiography that has such a pull on you as opposed to fiction? Or maybe another way of putting the question is, what is it about fiction storytelling that doesn't attract you as much?
I think actually I'm mostly drawn to nonfiction, not just in my output creatively, but also in my input. So I tend to exclusively read nonfiction. I watch a lot of documentaries, that kind of thing. And I think part of it is that when you're really looking into real things that are happening around us, there's so much wild stuff that's completely bananas that you would never believe if you made it up. And so I'm very drawn to those kinds of stories, and those tend to be the kinds of stories that I cover. It's not that I have anything against fiction. I'm just much more interested in the things that are happening in the world around me, or things that happened in the world around me that shaped kind of the environment that I'm in.
It's just that fiction's not your bag.
Yeah. It's not my bag. Maybe it'll be my bag someday, but right now it's not my bag.
Okay, so what brought you to Kilgore Books?
Dan brought me to Kilgore Books. He actually, Baseline Boulevard, he just republished. It was originally self-published, I believe, in 2015. And Dan saw it, and he reached out to me and said that he wanted to publish my next book. So I put out The Plunge, and then he said that he wanted to republish Baseline Boulevard so that it could get a larger audience, and also we could make it prettier, and now it has a spine and a beautiful cover, and it's just a higher quality book, which is great.
So now that Baseline Boulevard is out, is there anything that you're working on right now that you can tell us about?
No, I'm sort of in between projects. I was working on a really big project, and that sort of is on hiatus for reasons that are complicated. But yeah, so I'm sort of in between projects, and I'm looking for, I think, to do some smaller things while I plan a longer-term projects in the background. So I have things going on.
So what are some of these smaller things that you may be working on?
There's a couple of anthologies that I think that I'm going to contribute to, and then meanwhile I have this concept for a larger, I guess you call it a graphic narrative, because graphic novel really isn't appropriate when you're talking about nonfiction work. So I'm slowly putting together the skeleton of a graphic narrative about polar explorers.
About what?
Polar explorers.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Another history-based, fact-based narrative.
Yeah, I find myself being really drawn to not just historical stories, but specifically historical stories about people sort of like reaching for greatness and not quite getting there. I don't know, I looked back at the work that I'd made over the past several years and noticed a lot of those themes of sort of like reaching for greatness and not making it, or sort of like heroic futility, and had this moment where I realized, oh, all of the work I've been making is about failure. And I didn't mean to do that, but here I am, and maybe that's something I should talk to my therapist about. But for now, it is something that still really interests me, of sort of like people reaching outside of themselves and maybe coming to terms with failure, or most often in my work, because I'm drawn to very morbid stories, not having the opportunity, let's say, of coming to terms with their failure because it really didn't work out.
So if our listeners wanted to find out more about the kind of comics you create, both these books and otherwise, where would they go online?
They would go to my website, emigennis.com, EMIGENNIS.com.
Okay. So they can find out about your work that way, and they can they reach out to you on social media as well?
Absolutely. I'm Emi on Twitter. That's a palindrome. IMEMI.
Interesting. So great name on Twitter. Well, Emi, thank you very much for taking the time and talking with me for the podcast. And again, The Plunge and Baseline Boulevard, 2 titles from Kilgore Books and Comics that our listeners definitely should check out if they haven't already.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I talked with Emi Gennis at the Kilgore table, and standing there with her is another Kilgore creator, Alex Nall, and I have the pleasure of talking with him right now. Alex, how you doing?
Doing great. This has been such a fun day.
I'm good. So I'm glad. This has been a successful con for you so far?
Yeah, I tabled last year with a friend, but this is like my first time like being with like a publisher and everything, and I'm just having a great time with hanging out with MS Harkness and Emi and Dan Stafford. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. So we should mention that your book, Lawns, came out not too long ago, and it was part of Dan's latest Kilgore Books Kickstarter project, right?
Yeah, I think the book's debuted at Cake back in June.
Okay. So for those who, unfortunately, unlike me, did not back the Kilgore Kickstarter and haven't seen your book Lawns, how would you describe it?
It's a fictional story about a small town election that goes sort of haywire, and it's sort of an ensemble drama in that there are maybe 3 main characters, and you get to see how the conflict between the current mayor and his contender and a unruly neighbor kind of convolutes the rest of the town situation.
Yeah, and it is a substantive story. I mean, this is not a mini comic.
No, it's, I guess, my first graphic novel or whatever you want to call it, but it's about 100 pages, and I worked on it for a year, and I mostly do like comics about teaching in Chicago, and they're a little more lighthearted or colorful, whatever, but this was kind of, it's black and white, it's a little more real than the some of the characters I draw in like teaching comics or some of my other stuff. So I was kind of worried when I did it that this isn't going to really work because I don't usually do stuff like this. But I don't know. It was a lot of fun to do. I kind of learned how to redraw a lot of things that I thought, this is my style. But I guess that's the thing. Like the more you step outside of your comfort zone, the more you're going to be able to find, I can actually do this, or I can write a story like this way instead of the way I was doing before.
Well, when we first met this morning, when Dan introduced us, you had mentioned your work as a teacher as well as a cartoonist. And then you said just now that a lot of the comics that you had done in the past had something to do with teaching. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so I've worked in Chicago Public Schools for about 5 years now, doing different after-school programs, teaching, administrative work, but I taught comics classes there, and as I was doing the classes and seeing like the work that the kids did, it inspired me to share those stories, and I would just post them on online or whatever, and then I would get a response from people, and people would say, I relate to this, or this is really good, and that was the first time I felt like, okay, I'm working on something here that people can relate to, which felt good at the time. So I kind of kept doing that, and I always bring my students' comics to conventions at SPX or Cake or wherever, and we sell them for $1 just to raise money for the kids, and so that we can buy more like art supplies, and it's also like a really great confidence booster for them, for me to come back and say, hey, people love your work, like, keep making it. And look, here we one time we raised like $50 and we're able to buy like a long arm stapler for our classroom. So that was a really great thing to do. And then I'm working on a new book of material like that. So gonna keep doing that as long as I'm working in education or with kids.
So you mentioned teaching courses in comics. I'm assuming that it's the creation of comics, not necessarily the critical appreciation of comics.
Yeah. We don't. I'll bring stuff for them to look at and be like, here's. Let's try and draw our own Bone comic, or let's look at Peanuts and see how the characters talk to one another. But I don't get into like any of like the analytical stuff with them. Sometimes they're just happy to know that, they're not alone in liking Calvin and Hobbes or something.
And given the grade level, I'm assuming that you don't bring in examples, let's say, from Charles Burns or Gilbert Hernandez.
No, I think one time I brought in a Jason book, and there is some like nudity in Jason's stuff, but I just showed them I showed them just a page to be like, look, you can do a comic where like it's anthropomorphic animals, but no, I don't show them any of the other guys.
Okay. Now, you mentioned just a moment ago something that you alluded to, something that you're working on right now. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's going to be another follow-up collection of comics about working in schools, but this time I'm hoping to integrate like some narratives about the students themselves, and these are sort of like fictionalized versions of the students. I would never use like their actual names or whatever, but as long as I was in the school, I would kind of pick up little things about their home life or how they interacted with other students, and to me that's part of being in an educational setting, as well as getting to know your students and who they are as developing people, rather than just, he's a second grader and he likes to draw Star Wars, or she's into Shopkins or whatever's popular at the time. So I'm trying to make it more about their experience being in school, as well as my own experience of watching them go through it.
So if our listeners wanted to find out more about the kind of work that you do, including maybe more information on the new book from Kilgore Lawns, where online would they go?
Best way to look at my stuff would be at my blog, which is Alex Nall Blogspot, or my Instagram is where I'm I'm posting frequently.
So that's one word, alexnall.blogspot.com?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Alex, it was great meeting you, and thank you very much for taking the time and talking with me. Good luck with the rest of SPX.
Thanks so much.
Okay, I'm at the table of the Columbus College of Art and Design, located, appropriately enough, in Columbus, Ohio. And two people who were attending this table are Thomas and Sara Guzman. How are you guys doing at SPX this year?
We're doing pretty well. We sold a lot of books so far, and a lot of the student work is selling pretty well too.
So both of you are students at the college.
Yes, I am a senior illustration major.
And I'm a senior illustration major as well, but we're both working on comics theses.
Okay. So tell me a bit about your theses.
Oh, you can go ahead first.
Okay. Well, mine's about a photojournalist that is very disconnected from reality, and as time goes on, his photographs reflect how he's starting to come to terms with how he can't stay detached, and life isn't as blank as you think it can be. Like, you can't push away life. It's violent, and you just have to see it for what it is.
Okay. And then Ash?
My thesis is actually, it's a collection of dreams that I've had that I'm turning into mini comics.
That's interesting in that I just a little while ago was talking with Nathan Gelgud, who is a Koyama Press creator, and his new book, A House in the Jungle, he said was based on a dream that he had, and I was asking him if he kept a dream diary. He said no. Now, Ash, do you keep a dream diary and use that as a basis for your comics?
I do. When I wake up, the first thing I do is I think about the dreams so that I remember details, and then I sit up and I'll type them out.
I have to ask you, do you find that the more you write about your dreams, the more you remember?
Yeah, I think I have to pause before I write about them, though. Otherwise, I'll get caught up in like the details and then start to forget like what happens next.
When I was an undergraduate, I kept a dream diary, and I found keeping a dream diary is kind of like exercising, right? When you stretch in order to be more effective in either your jog or whatever exercise it is. And the more I would write about my dream diary, the more I would remember about my dreams. And it got to the point that I was taking almost half the morning writing down the detail of my dreams.
Yeah, it's easy to do that. My dreams are really long and vivid, and like since I started writing them out, I'll have really long, like 3-part dreams that are incredibly realistic.
So like television series.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
And you're using these dreams as a basis for the variety of stories in your thesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the comic is actually, it's just all the dreams kind of blending together, and then it like parts where I'll wake up and how it like compares to reality.
Okay. Well, I wonder if you could talk to us a little about some of the stuff that the students at the college are coming out with. And in particular, I was interested in the Spitball Anthology.
So the Spitball Anthology is where 10 students every spring semester team up with 10 professional comic book writers. And we do 5 pages each. And the writer, we team up with them and we talk to them, we Skype with them. And it's just a really fun process where we have issue number 4 of Spitball, where we have G. Willow Wilson. I worked with Mike Freiheit, who does Cleopatra in Space for Scholastic. And it's just really awesome to get to know what the real world of comics is like and what collaboration can really bring out in others.
So with these various anthologies that come out, you guys as students are working with already established comics creators. You mentioned Wilson, and I see on the sign behind you some of the people that are listed like Jonathan Hickman, Grace Ellis, Greg Rucka, Evan Dorkin, one of my favorites. And they work with you on the anthology.
Yeah, we Skype with them, we email with them, we talk on the phone with them. It's a very close process depending on who you get. Like, if they're really busy like G. Willow Wilson, maybe it's not as much as somebody who's working on a Scholastic book, but you still get to have a great experience talking to them, learning with them as they help you produce the best work you possibly can.
Yeah. Have either of you had the pleasure of working with Evan Dorkin or communicating with Dorkin?
I have not.
No, I have not.
I ask about that because I've talked with him several times on the podcast. He's an experience in terms of communicating with him, so that would be something you would never forget.
Yeah, I've met some of the other authors, the writers, because they come to all of these expos that we go to. So Kelly Sue DeConnick is really awesome. Matt Fraction is super sweet, and he was telling me like who I remind him of, and he's like, "I'll work with you in a heartbeat." Like, they're super sweet people, and that's what's great about Spitball is that we get to attend all these cons, promoting the books, selling our artwork, and it's just a really unique program.
Okay, so in getting back to the Spitball anthology, when these come out, does each issue or volume have a particular theme?
No, they do not.
Okay, so it's just from that particular year, I guess it is, because they come out annually?
They come out every summer.
Okay, yeah. So it's just the students who were currently at the point in their program to where they can work, and then whatever they do. So there's nothing really cohesive about the anthology?
No, it's just what the writer writes, and then you pick your top 3 scripts, and then your professor assigns you with what writer they think you'll have like the best story with.
Okay, so basically you spitball it.
Yeah, so we spitball it, yeah.
And how long has Spitball been going on?
It's been,
We're at 4. Yeah, we're on our 4th anthology. It was just released.
So 4 years.
So 4 years, yeah. Okay. And it comes out every summer. So the latest one came out this summer. And we can expect one every summer after that. Well, listen, thank you guys for talking with me for the podcast. And again, the anthology is Spitball. If you don't know about it already, it is an annual publication put out by the Columbus College of Arts and Design. And by the way, where can people, maybe online or via social media, go to find out more about Spitball and even get copies of the anthology?
Yeah, they can check out Big Cartel. We have, if they Google CCAD and Big Cartel, it should pop up.
CCADillustration.bigcartel.com.
Okay, so they can get copies that way. Okay, well, thank you for talking with me on the show, and good luck with the rest of SPX.
Thank you very much.
Listeners of the podcast may remember that earlier this year, Gene and I discussed, I think, issues number 4 and 5 of The Strumpet. A really interesting anthology, and right now I'm standing in front of the editor of The Strumpet, Ellen Lindner. Ellen, how you doing?
Hi, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing well, and we met last night, I think the first time. We went out with a group of us for dinner, and it was a lot of fun. We met at, the Silver Diner, and they were reinventing the diner.
This is probably my favorite place to eat at SPX, just because it is so wacky. It's basically a diner that's been taken over, I think, by a Quebecois chef, and he is reinventing it. And so I had a delicious meal that definitely was nothing like a diner you get where I grew up on Long Island. So consider the diner reinvented.
That's right. And we were sitting next to one another, joking throughout the night about things being reinvented at this diner. The meals, the presentation, the jukebox. They were just reinventing the diner.
And it wasn't it great?
Yeah.
And now we're reinventing comics.
That's right. So now you have come out with, issue 6? Of Strumpet, is that out, or?
So basically, when I started doing the Strumpet, I was living in London, and I just moved back to New York City. And in my mind, we were going to do 5 issues, kind of bringing together women and trans cartoonists from the United States, the UK comic scene, which I think is actually underknown, if that's a word. It's less known than I think it should be. In the United States, and also cartoonists from the rest of the world. We've had cartoonists from Poland, from France, from South Korea, basically anywhere. But it's all about kind of uniting women and trans cartoonists, and every issue has a theme. So our most recent issue, which is Origin Stories, is issue 5 of The Strumpet, and it's all about where people and the things we love have come from.
So you're saying that there's not going to be an issue 6?
So my dream project would be, instead of doing an issue 6, to do a collection of my highlights from The Strumpet, along with interviews with some key creators. People, again, who I feel are maybe a little bit under-recognized. People I love, like Lisa Rosalie Eisenberg, who's a fantastic educator and cartoonist based in Portland, Oregon, or Patrice Aggs, who is a fabulous cartoonist who grew up in Detroit, but who currently lives on the south coast of the United Kingdom. And she has a story in Origin Stories, which is one of the most heartbreaking kind of portraits of a childhood in a segregated America. It's just really fabulous. And so someone like that, I would love to bring more attention to.
Okay. Now I see another book that you have up here is, I guess, one of your own, The Black Feather Falls. So I'm wondering if you could educate me about this one, because I'm not familiar with it.
So, I was living in the UK. I lived there for 8 years, and I am obsessed with murder mysteries. I really love murder mysteries. But I was also obsessed with, there's a particular photographer I really love called Lee Miller. And at one point I wanted to do a biography about her, but instead I kind of took elements of her life story and just kind of transmogrified them into a murder mystery set in Jazz-Age London about an American expat who gets mixed up in the murder of a World War I veteran who is living homeless on the streets of London. And she basically decides to kind of figure this out, but it turns out she's kind of addressing a trauma in her own life. And so I like to think it's a murder mystery that has really interesting elements of a personal history, but also the effect that war has on our society.
Okay, and when did this come out?
So that's a really good question. It was nominated for an Ignatz Award in 2014, and if my memory serves, it's really late in the day. It came out in the collection came out in 2016.
Okay. Now coming back to the Strumpet, you're a creator yourself, but also you were the editor of the Strumpet, and I'm wondering about some of the challenges. I've worked as an editor, and I have my own experiences, but I'm wondering from your perspective as a comics editor, what are some of the challenges that you faced in pulling together these 5 issues of the Strumpet?
Well, I mean, in comics, as one can imagine, I think the biggest challenge is often money. We've had really generous support from Kickstarter backers throughout the history of the Strumpet. And with their help, we were able to do something with issue 5, which is really important to me, which is pay our contributors a page rate. As an artist and as a creator, I feel like people really need to be recompensed for their artwork, for their time. Working for exposure is not enough. And basically, with the Strumpet, like we just do our best to foster our creators. And so creating an environment where you can do that in small press comics is challenging, but I feel like we got closer to doing that with this issue.
Okay. So you mentioned that one of the things you'd like to do as a next project or a future project is to pull together various pieces from the 5 issues of Strumpet, kind of like a highlight collection. Is there anything that you're currently working on right now or making plans for?
Specific to Strumpet?
Oh, no, of your own.
Oh. Well, thank you for asking. So at the moment, I'm doing a series of comics for the Spiral Bound section of Medium.com, and Spiral Bound focuses on autobiographical comics. And so it's been a really cool venue for being able to do short comics for a non-comics reading audience. And I've covered topics like the death of a friend, not having kids and having to talk to people about that, which is always super awkward. I'm also working on a series of zines about women in baseball, and each issue, it's called The Cranklets Chronicle, and every issue has a story about a woman who was involved in a variety of professional baseball in some way. And so the first issue is out now, and it's about Joan Payson, who was the co-founder and the financial backing for the New York Mets when they were founded in 1962.
But not sappy like A League of Their Own.
So League of Their Own, unfortunately, is kind of often, people just assume that's the whole story when it comes to women in baseball. But in the 1880s, there were college teams at Vassar and Smith, which is my alma mater. Women were passionate about baseball. They were passionate fans. A fun fact, the song Take Me Out to the Ball Game is sung from the perspective of a woman. And so basically women have been fans, players, and owners as well in professional baseball since the beginning. And my next story is about a woman named Effa Manley who owned a team with her husband, Abe Manley, in the what were called the Negro Leagues, back when baseball was segregated. And I think her story is really fascinating. it doesn't show American society in the best light, but I feel like, especially now, we have to confront this history. And so right now, that's my main personal project. But I'm always looking for new projects, so you never know what might happen next.
Yeah. And by the way, I didn't mean to rag on A League of Their Own, although I do think that the movie would have been much more impactful, at least for me, if you didn't have the sentimental narrative frame at the beginning and especially at the end. If it were just the main story, I think it would have been much more successful and less sappy.
So a friend recently recommended that I should watch Bull Durham, which I'd never seen before, and actually has a totally different perspective on women in baseball. Yeah. And it is, spoilers, it's a way sexier perspective.
Yeah.
But there's this woman in it who's basically the biggest baseball expert of all time. And it's really charming.
Susan Sarandon, right?
Yeah.
To the groupie.
But she's a baseball genius. She tells all these all these silly young players, like, this is how you need to play the game. And I found it great also because people forget about minor league baseball and the role that has in a lot of communities in the United States. And I'm lucky to live in a city, New York City, that has its own minor league team, the Brooklyn Cyclones. And I just love minor league baseball. So that might be my bet for like a better baseball movie. Okay. But to each their own.
Yeah. So if our listeners wanted to find out more about the kind of work that you do, maybe look and get back issues of The Strumpet, or maybe even check out the Cranklets Chronicles, where would they go online for both the anthology and your own work?
So my website is probably a good place to start because I have links to all these things. And my website is littlewhitebird.com.
Littlewhitebird, one word.com. Why Little White Bird?
Because no one can ever spell my last name. And so when I was choosing a URL, Little White Bird is a zine I did in college, and I was like, people can say that, they can spell it. It is 3 very common English language words. And so far, so good.
Yeah. Well, in essence, you're reinventing the URL.
I'm reinventing everything right now. Yeah. But the thing is, at the end of the day at SPX, it's so wonderful, but also so draining. I think I need to be reinvented.
Yeah, and it's getting to be the end of the first day of the con, and like you, I need to be reinvented and reinvigorated. So, Ellen, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me for the podcast, and I had a good time at dinner last night. Maybe we'll hang out again tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Derek. It was my pleasure.
I want to thank Mike, Madeline, Kelly, Claire, Karl, Max, Ryan, Scott, Nathan, Emi, Alex, Ash, Sarah, and Ellen for taking the time to talk with me at this past weekend's Small Press Expo. On Thursday, I'll release the second on-location episode, that one including 15 amazing creators, so keep your ears open for that one. And if you want to find great prices on a variety of other comics, then head on over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find unbeatable prices on a variety of publications, including bundles from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my mini conversations at the 2018 SPX. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, and on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. Again, be sure to check back later this week for our second on-location episode at Small Press Expo. Until then, take care.